Now let's take a look at another example to understand the line of reasoning concept. Now what you see on your screen is the other example that says that since there is water scarcity in Rajasthan, the whole of North India must be plagued by severe water shortage. Now the since is your indicator to say that this is your reason and the rest of it is your conclusion. So this says that since Rajasthan has water shortage, it must follow that the entire North India must have severe water scarcity as such. Now you will not obviously agree with the logic of the argument, but understand that there is a logic that binds the two parts of the argument, and that logic is the line of reasoning. That's what we are primarily focusing on right now. So here you understand that the line of reasoning that's binding the two is that the premise is extremely specific, talking about Rajasthan, while the conclusion is general, talking about the entire North India. So that's the logic that's binding the two. Now how do we actually recognize which part of your argument is the premise and which part is your conclusion? For this we will take the help of certain identifiers which are called as conclusion identifiers, premise identifiers as such. So these are the key words that will help you recognize that some part is the result of some other part, or some other part is actually providing support for some other part. So conclusion, you have words like hence, therefore, clearly, so, thus, and things like that, implies that, suggests that, indicates that. All these will be your conclusion identifiers to help you recognize or identify which part is your conclusion. Similarly, when you look at premise identifiers, you have words which are first conjunctions, let's say, which explain something like since, because, as, for. That's one part. Then a little while back we also understood that an argument need not have only one premise. There could be multiple reasons put together that derive a certain conclusion. So when you have multiple premises, there is every possibility that these premises are adding on to the original or the main premise, and these are all subordinate premises. How do you recognize or identify these subordinate premises? So when you look at words like and, that is a thought extension, or a word like also, additionally, furthermore, moreover, all these are indicators that, hey, I am now extending my previous thought flow, and hence this also qualifies as a premise. That's one thing. Then you also have certain identifiers which are known as counter premise identifiers. What these counter premises are, we will understand them much better a little later, but for the moment understand that an argument may also have a counter premise. Now as the name suggests, a counter premise tends to counter a premise. In other words, a counter premise to start with is first a premise in itself. In other words, a counter premise is also a reason for a conclusion. It is as good as a fact. But this tends to contradict an already existing situation or an already existing premise. Because it counters an existing situation, it's called a counter premise. Now under what circumstances are these used and what kind of questions are asked, we'll learn a little later. So how do you recognize counter premises? So when you have words that indicate a thought contrast, thought extension is premise identifiers, thought contrast is counter premise identifiers. Words like but, yet, though, although, even though, nonetheless, nevertheless, despite, however, these kinds of words will help you recognize that this part of the argument is your counter premise. Now, is it necessary that your arguments in the exam will definitely have all these parts or will give you all these identifiers and make things easy for you? There's absolutely no guarantee. Your argument may not use any of these words at all, yet form a logic, yet form an argument, but your job of identifying the conclusion and separating it out from the premises still holds good, because at the end of the day, unless you recognize what the author is primarily trying to convey to you through that short passage or the argument, you will not be able to understand the larger context of the argument, nor will you be able to answer the specific questions that your exam throws at you. So always remember, it's extremely important that you first identify the conclusion of your argument, if there is any. So with the help of conclusion identifiers, you recognize that. But what if conclusion identifiers are not given? Then try searching for premise identifiers. What if they are also not given? What do you do then? Then what you do is do this why test or the how test. In other words, assume that one part of your argument is your conclusion and question that part with a why. How do we do that? Let's go back to our example of X waking up late and missing the show. Let's go back. So you know that X woke up late for the show, hence he missed it. He missed it is your conclusion. Question this, hence he missed it, with a why. Why did X miss the show? You will get a logical response that says because he woke up late. The moment you are able to get a logical response with the premise identifier like because, it means that you have spotted the conclusion correctly. Now, for the sake of argument, let's also do the why test with the other part of the argument. So let's question the first part. Why did X wake up late? Your answer that because he missed the show is not logical at all in the context. It doesn't sound logical at all. So that rules out the possibility that any other part of the argument can be your conclusion. So through the why test and how test, you recognize the conclusion of your argument correctly. Now let's move on to understanding what these quantifiers are. Now, as the name suggests, quantifier is something that quantifies something. So words that tend to quantify substance, matter or anything of that sort is a quantifier. Now, why are these quantifiers important? How are they useful? Now you also have to understand that whatever you are learning in the critical reasoning sessions, they will help you in not just in critical reasoning, they are going to help you in reading comprehension, they are going to help you in analytical writing as such, so in things like that. So keep this in mind. So what are these quantifiers? Let's understand this. Now supposing, let's say you talk about somebody called X spotting 2 black panthers in Masai Mara. So somebody called X went on a safari to Masai Mara and he spotted 2 black panthers. So now, what are the observations or what are the conclusions that somebody can draw? Let's say somebody says that all panthers in Masai Mara are black. Would you agree with that? Is that a valid conclusion or an invalid conclusion? Now you will automatically tell me that this is invalid because there is a word all, whereas your sample space is just 2 black panthers. So you have a minute sample space from which you are deriving a mega conclusion or a generic conclusion, and hence though there is a line of reasoning, yet the line of reasoning is not logical enough for the conclusion to be valid. That is what you will tell me, which is correct. Supposing somebody says that many panthers in Masai Mara are black. Would you agree with that? You will say this is also invalid. Now supposing we say few panthers in Masai Mara are black, that would also remain invalid. Supposing we say there are only 2 black panthers in Masai Mara. So what are we doing now? In the first few cases we are broadening the scope, we have generalized it way too much. Then we have sort of narrowed down the scope way too much. Now we are limiting it to just 2. It's not even a few or anything, it's just 2. Supposing you say some panthers in Masai Mara are black, would you agree with that? Yes, you would now agree with it and tell me that this is a valid conclusion. So remember that quantifiers help you understand if the context of your argument is logical enough or no. It's extremely important because your answer options also tend to use quantifiers sometimes unnecessarily. So this is one method or one trick that you can employ to recognize which answer options are logical, which answer options are not logical because of the usage of these quantifiers. Now here you have a table that lists down all the quantifiers. There are 3 models of them: overstated, understated. What balances the 2 are the moderators. So overstated quantifiers are those words that tend to blow things out of proportion: all, many, more, most, often, always, usually, generally, blowing things out of proportions. Understatements do the exact opposite. They understate things: few, little, rarely, often, minimum, hardly, and things like that. What moderators do is they tend to do a balancing act between the 2. Some, sometimes, things like that. So this is what we have to understand about moderators, about quantifiers.